Hi, all. Thanks so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to see you introducing yourselves in the chat and seeing that we have multidisciplinary professionals from all across the country. My name is Dana Flightman. I am the Senior Training and Awareness Specialist at SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. Of course, February is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, and so we'll be focusing on stalking for sure, but particularly how it relates to teen dating violence and affects adolescents more broadly. So I do training on stalking all across the country, both online and in person, for audiences including victim services, campus professionals, law enforcement, really anyone on the victim service and or criminal justice end of recognizing and responding to stalking. And I usually start by asking this question, which I'll launch here as a poll. And that's, have you had the opportunity to attend previous training on the topic of stalking? So you can let me know, is this your first one? If you're like, I think I've been to one or two, or if you're like, ugh, I've been to so many of these, I could teach this. And of course, there's no one expert on stalking. I am not claiming to be that. So don't hesitate to share your experience, your insights, your observations from your work on the ground. All right, so I'm going to shut this down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and share results. Okay, great. Looks like we have some regulars here, in which case, thanks for coming back. About half the room saying, I've been to several, which is wonderful. But for the other half, either the first one or maybe one or two. And not that you aren't special because you are, but this is fairly typical. In fact, this group has attended more stalking training than my typical audience, I would say. Um, Often half to the whole room haven't had the chance to attend stalking training previously. And that's not a reflection on anyone as a professional, but it is a reflection that stalking is very undertrained in our field. And I think particularly underdiscussed when we're talking about healthy relationships, teen dating violence, and how it might affect some of the younger folks that we work with. So we want to remember that stalking is one of the 4 crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, but it's always kind of like and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org because so often it's like, oh yeah, and stalking. It's kind of in the mix. It's sort of covered. But the reality is that stalking is a prevalent victimization that's affecting our adolescents at similar rates to dating violence. It's criminal, it's traumatic, it's dangerous, but it's really under-resourced for teens and for the general population. When you think about it, there is no national stalking hotline. There are few, if any, standalone stalking crisis services. Stalking is rarely specifically mentioned in healthy relationship consent education. So it really often falls to folks like the people on this call who might be primarily focused on and have more resources and training around intimate partner and sexual violence to kind of add stalking on. And I'm not saying that's fair or easy because y'all are already busy and have plenty of other work to do, but it is important because these survivors really have nowhere else to go, and there are not a lot of sources of accurate information about stalking. So look, you're the ones on the ground. You know how to do what you do. My hope is by the end of the session, you move that and stalking a little more to the beginning of the sentence and see some of the critical work that you're already doing, particularly with young people, through the lens of stalking with some new tools, ideas, and frameworks. So SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking, which is a fancy way of saying that we're here to help the helpers and y'all are the helpers. And so if you would like further training, if you'd like a resource that you're not seeing on our website, if you're working with a stalking survivor and want to talk through that case with somebody, you can reach out to us. We're usually free of charge and we are here to help. So our website, which I'll refer to throughout the training, and my wonderful colleague Emma is on to share some resources in the chat throughout. Our website is stalkingawareness.org. There we have practitioner guides. Those are broken out by discipline. So we have a section for victim services, for awareness educators, for campuses, for law enforcement, and so on. And we really have everything from a 20+ page guide on incorporating stalking response into supervised visitation and exchange programs to, 1 page infographic on stalking in adolescents. So really a wide range of materials. We have training modules, so if you do any kind of awareness education or your partners do, if you're talking consent, bystander, healthy relationships, you want to be talking stalking as well. So we have programs you can pick up and lead with slides and scripts and videos. We have discussion guides on every season of the TV show You on Netflix and other ways to get folks talking stalking without you having to reinvent the wheel. We also have what I informally call my Sister Can You Spare a Slide campaign. That's, hey, if you only have time for one slide on stalking in your, say, dating abuse presentation, here it is, and at least mention it. We have victim resources, so we are not a direct service provider. So please don't send survivors directly to SPARC because we'll just have to be nice and send them back to local services. But we do have resources that you can share with victims. For example, these brochures you can order on our website in English and Spanish. You can put your local information here in the back. So if you have something to hand your survivor of, dating violence, sexual assault, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have fact sheets, infographics, these handbooks with some basic stalking information available in 10 different languages and other ways to educate folks on stalking and webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck because we have an archive of recorded webinars and we're called SPARC, so I got us to call it the SPARchives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out on the SPARchives anytime. We're also on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC, we want you to follow us. We will not be scared and sign up for our newsletter. It's an anti-stalking organization. We will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt into our newsletter, and it's one we send every couple of months. It's not one that you're getting all the time. So I hope that you will connect with us. All right, so why learn about stalking? With apologies to folks who have heard this spiel before, but it's always good to have a refresher, I think, on the urgency of stalking victimization. Stalking is an important thing to understand, whether it's happening to a teen, an adult, an older adult, or anyone across the lifespan. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states and every U.S. territory, on most tribal codes, and in the military justice system. It also violates campus policy and often falls under Title IX, and it's a reportable offense under the Clery Act. So it might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking's actually criminal, but stalking is a crime. And it's traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation. We're also finding through our new Vital Signs project, which is addressing stalking in healthcare spaces, that this manifests in physical health concerns as well, including higher rates of chronic disease, like cancer and diabetes and arthritis. And so what's maybe a bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And you have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. So you can imagine the kind of toll that takes psychologically and the kind of hypervigilance that often results. Many lose time from work. 1 in 8 lose some time. About half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking victims are not always the protected class of worker, so they can lose their job entirely. And many relocate. This really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about moving and want to, it's expensive, it's stressful, it's not something you do because someone's kind of annoying you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating to get away from these stalkers, which I think helps to illustrate how consuming and traumatic this crime can be. It's always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And I like this quote because it illustrates what so many stalking survivors have said to me, that sense of it's never really over. That I knew the day probation or parole ended, they'd call me and they did. Um, that, oh, it's Valentine's Day, I'm gonna get a creepy card in the mail, and they do. That sense of rather than it being a traumatic event they can heal from over time, this person can always come back. It may escalate their behavior. And stalking is dangerous, and this is true when it happens to teens as well as when it happens to adults. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm victims, and in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed and minimized as, oh, it's just texting, it's following, it's social media stuff, it's annoying, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case escalates to the point of violence or homicide, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of homicide, attempted homicide, violence, attempted violence, and at that point, often responders start looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole history of stalking victimization here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not handled with the urgency needed. So we don't want to do that, right? We don't want to wait for violence and say, oh, it turns out there was stalking the whole time. No, we want to intervene, identify and intervene for the stalking itself, because this is one of the few crimes where that early identification and intervention can help prevent further violence, homicide, trauma, um, possibly even death, but it's quite underreported. And so fewer than a third of our victims are reporting to law enforcement. And these numbers look pretty similar for dating violence and sexual violence. And even fewer are seeking victim services. Now, data for adolescents specifically is limited, though I am showing you the studies that we have on that. But looking at college campuses, the numbers are quite similar. Fewer than a third of our students on college campuses are talking to any sort of formal service. So you can tell me in the chat why. For adolescents in particular, why might adolescent stalking victims not report? What might keep them from sharing what's going on the minute that they think, huh, I'm getting kind of freaked out here? They don't know they can. Absolutely. Who do they talk to about this? Right? Do they talk to the school? Do they talk to police? Does it even rise to that? What is it? Um, they don't want to make it a big deal. I think that that's feeling like they're overreacting. Yeah, I think that's huge, and it's not unique to our young people, but probably especially for our teens, the sense of I'm an adult, basically. I can handle it. I'm not a kid. I don't want to make it a whole thing. And we think about this, the social structure of, say, a high school, that's their whole world. It's pretty hard to leave, right? And so um, to really take someone on, to take a stalker on within that kind of closed bubble, right, can be really difficult socially and just logistically. Um, Fear of not being believed. Yeah, they're going to say I look crazy. They're going to say I'm making it up. Absolutely. Um, and there's also that minimization that victims do themselves, right? So feeling they might be afraid the responder will say I'm overreacting or that I'm making this up. They might feel like, maybe I am overreacting. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to be dramatic. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, which someone mentioned, right? They might care about that person and or the social ramifications of getting that person in trouble. Absolutely. Um, Thinking it's romantic. Yeah, they might be scared, but have seen those behaviors presented as charming, romantic, or funny, and be thinking, well, I don't, maybe it's just I'm overreacting, right? And kind of minimize their own experience. Um, and speaking of that minimization, yeah, that we hear the word stalking used casually, and so they may not know what it really is. And that fear of retaliation, absolutely. We know that if action is taken against that stalker, they might escalate their behavior against the victim. And or what others will say or think at school. Yeah, that other people who are, say, friends with that offender um, might escalate, right, and start to target that victim. And so, for all of those reasons, we know that most victims don't report. This is a study in the state of Colorado, and this was for adults experiencing domestic violence. Here we have almost 1,800 cases, about 300 involve clear documented evidence of stalking. So that doesn't always happen for all the reasons we just said, many of which apply to adults as well, right? That fear of retaliation or escalation, shame, no one will believe me, I don't want to make a fuss, minimization, all those reasons, right? But here we have 298 cases that have clear documented evidence of stalking that meet the statute. How many cases do you think were charged as stalking? A stalking charge. It was one. Only one case was charged as stalking. And look, a lot goes into charging decisions. I understand that. Stalking is not always the most strategic charge, but it's also not never the most strategic charge. And we see this again and again in every similar study. Absolutely, it's underreported for all the reasons that we said. And even when it is reported, even when there is sufficient evidence, our law enforcement are not necessarily looking at these behaviors through the lens of stalking and holding our offenders accountable. But our victim services are not off the hook either because even fewer victims are seeking victim services than going to law enforcement. And of that 16% that try to get help, 1 in 4 don't receive any. So what's going on there? I don't think it's evil victim services trying to send people away, but I do think they might walk in the wrong door and that those victim service providers may or may not have the resources or training to recognize what's going on as stalking and or to serve those stalking victims. It's also confusing where to go as a stalking survivor, especially if the stalker is not an intimate partner. So it's not dating abuse related, because if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend, why would I Google like dating violence resources, my county? Right? Like that's not very intuitive, but that's actually where the folks like most of you on this call are could be found, right? Who could help me. And it's also a good time to remember that if you are receiving federal or most state funding, you are required to serve all victims of stalking, intimate partner and non-intimate partner. So thinking about how you're reaching and serving all of those folks. So, big picture, we have the serious victimization. Our stalkers are not being held accountable. Our victims are not getting the help they need, but it's okay. We're going to fix it today. We're going to talk about what is stalking, the behavioral definition, which is the same as the campus definition. We'll look at the diversity of stalking behaviors, emphasizing those that particularly impact our adolescents. We'll look at the intersection of stalking with dating violence and sexual assault, as well as that spectrum of the conflation of stalking with romantic pursuit and bullying, and then some big picture tips on response. So, what is stalking exactly? Well, it depends who you ask. There's your different states have different statutes, and it's good to know your state statute. So, we have a map on our website where you can click on your state or territory and find your specific statute, and that's good to know. Um, the campus definition is what I'm talking about today, and it's a little bit broader. And so you really want to know both because you might be working with a student and say, okay, on campus, this is stalking. We can adjudicate it that way. If you go down the street to law enforcement, may or may not meet that standard, right? Um, but again, we're talking about the behavioral definition because this tells us what stalkers really are and what stalking really looks like. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and all of these are bummers. Okay, we don't like any of them. But which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. So I'm going to launch each as a poll and have you make some pretty quick decisions here. Um, so this first scenario, student peeks into the girls' locker room to watch the girls in there undress. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, I'm shutting it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, looks like about a quarter of folks saying yes, and 3/4 saying no, I don't think that's stalking. Okay, how about the second one? An ex-partner spreads vicious rumors repeatedly about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, shutting it down in five, four, three, two, one. Okay, that one's closer to 50-50. Really split the room. I hope we can get along after this, y'all. Okay. And then last but not least, we have this orchestra teacher, conductor, who's regularly texting a student violinist to ask if they practiced, emailing at weird hours, calls them names in front of the other students during rehearsals. Does that sound like stalking to you? All right, shutting it down in five, four, three, two, one. Oops. Share? Okay, great. So it looks like most folks saying yes and about a quarter saying no, I don't think so. So thanks for doing that. A few things might have come up for you making these snap decisions. You might have been thinking, well, how many times did this happen? Or how did the student feel about it? Or what else was going on? And so, luckily for you, I'm going to go through the behavioral definition and I'll use these scenarios in there to help explain. So, behaviorally slash on campuses, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others or suffer substantial emotional distress. So, to break that down a little bit, it is a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or one off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most statutes and policies. So, you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably today: pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm talking about the same thing. It's two or more behaviors that make up that pattern. And those behaviors can be quite varied. Um, so let's say I'm stalking you because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay. So maybe Monday I text you. Tuesday I'm mad you didn't respond. I smash your headlights. Wednesday I feel kind of bad about that. So I send you flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors. And so stalkers often combine acts that are crimes and or student conduct violations on their own, like say that property damage if it happened on school property, um, with other behaviors that may not be crimes on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So that's confusing because it's not illegal to text somebody or to send someone flowers, but it is illegal to stalk somebody. It's also confusing because our system tends to be pretty incident based. Our officers are responding to a call for service, and for victim services, we might be focused on what brought that person in today. And so I encourage you, whenever a victim's telling you about an upsetting incident, zoom out. Is this an isolated incident? Is it part of a bigger pattern of behavior? Because that person who's telling you about, say, their smashed headlight may or may not think to mention, I think I know who did this, and they've been texting me. And I got this creepy note in my locker. I think they might have said that. I think they might have, posted that. And my email's acting weird. I feel like they hacked in there, though I can't prove it, right? They may or may not think to mention that because, oh, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this course and we're talking about this incident. But it needs to be what we're talking about because it's letting you know, oh, this is not an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger pattern of behavior. This could actually be a stalking case, and all those behaviors are relevant. And stalking is directed at a specific person. So in the first scenario where a student peers in the girls' locker room, that might still be a crime. That's not really stalking because stalking is directed at a specific person. So if they're looking at whoever happened to be in there that moment, that's not really stalking behavior. Now, it could become stalking behavior. Let's say they identify a certain girl in there and then follow her out and contact her. Okay, now it is directed at a specific person, and we have two or more incidents, right? So that could be part of the course of conduct, but that on its own, it's not really stalking because stalking is directed at a specific person or persons. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion. Maybe our stalker is targeting, say, their ex-partner. Ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now they're stalking their ex and the ex's new romantic interest. And our stalkers are trying to get access to and information about their victims. So they're likely to reach out to the victims' family, friends, classmates, teammates, neighbors, others, right? Because they're trying to get to that victim. And so a lot of folks can be involved or even considered co-victimized in a stalking case. But we still see that behaviorally as directed at a specific person because they're trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really important to understanding stalking, and it's what separates it from a victimization it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically repeated conduct that would make someone feel frustrated, angry, annoyed, disrespected, create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So, of course, it would depend on the context and the power dynamics and all of that. But when I look at that third scenario, if I'm, in the orchestra and orchestra teacher is emailing me at weird hours and yelling at me in front of my classmates, like that's weird. That's inappropriate. They're the worst. I don't know why they're treating me that way. I'm not necessarily afraid of them. I can more or less live a normal life, but I feel really disrespected and singled out in a way that's not appropriate. But let's say that I'm driving home. I think I see their car a couple back. They text me a picture of myself walking my pug. They say, "Why are you doing that instead of practicing?" They start calling my mom to ask if I'm practicing. I don't know how they got her number or like what the rules are about teachers calling parents, but it seems like this is weird. They come up to me when I'm at the movies with my friends and say, "Hey, what are you doing here? You should be practicing," right? Now I'm scared because I'm like, this person seems very fixated on me. Are they going to hurt me or something? What part of my life is safe or separate from this teacher? And so harassment can be part of a course of conduct or kind of become stalking, but they're a little bit different. And I think that matters for a couple of reasons. One is that stalking's typically a higher charge. And so when it's stalking, we want to call it that for those accountability reasons. And also, our victims of stalking are at greater risk of violence than our harassment victims. Um, I'd also say I think we all receive training on harassment, which is important. And it's important to just introduce the idea of when does this cross the line into stalking? And where it crosses the line, though, of course, there's certainly gray areas there, right? Is when it becomes about fear, when our victim is afraid. And so, afraid of what? Well, afraid of bodily harm, certainly, including sexual violence to self or others, as well as substantial emotional distress. Um, so emotional distress is also about fear, but it's recognizing that fear may be of outcomes in place of or in addition to physical violence. You might be afraid of getting kicked out of school and suspended or expelled for reasons that the stalker made up, and now your life is ruined. You can't go to college with your friends. You might be afraid of an intimate image being shared and ruining your reputation. People experiencing emotional distress don't, it's not just having a bad day or feeling frustrated or feeling insulted. They generally feel that they cannot live a normal life because of the interference from the stalker. They feel that they're under surveillance, that their life's being invaded, that they're being sabotaged, that they're being intimidated. The best quote that I saw about it was a victim who said, "It's like he's taken my life without killing me." So that sense of I cannot live a normal life and I am afraid to do anything because of the stalker's sabotage. So, of the three scenarios, I'd say the most likely to be stalking would probably be that second one with the spreading vicious rumors. And you might be thinking, like, well, people gossip, especially our teenagers. That's not necessarily stalking. And you're right. But we see some really targeted kinds of rumors that are quite scary. For example, there was a case where our victim was applying for jobs. So she was sending, her cover letter, resume to a bunch of potential employers. Um, and the stalker used AI to create some nude and pornographic images of her and then wrote a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually. Every time she'd email for a job, he'd then follow up to that potential employer with those images and those sexual rumors. He'd then go on LinkedIn or on the company website, find all the potential colleagues, and send it to them as well. So that's beyond like, oh, people gossip, right? That's really scary, and it's targeting and sabotaging this person in such a way that she cannot live a normal life. She can't get a job. She's being approached in a sexual way and doesn't know why. And so when I see that, I think, oh, that's a little bit beyond harassment. That's really scary. That might be stalking. But fear's tough conceptually, right? Because what's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch. This is literally a 3-second video and think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. So apologies to those who hate spiders, but my guess is a lot of folks on this call are identifying with this face left here on the screen, this like calm it down lady, right? It's just this little thing. And we can understand where this guy's coming from. But what if I told you that the same woman was bit by a spider last year that looked just like that, had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died? Will we still be making this face at her? Hopefully not, because what did I give you there? Context, information, the backstory, and context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in a stalking case because often what's scariest to a victim or survivor may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. For example, this was a case where the survivor did call law enforcement, and she's so upset. She's yelling, she's screaming. And all she'd say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, okay, lady. And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out it was a stalking survivor who had relocated, address confidentiality, got off social media, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with this old nickname for her on it. And so when I tell that story in person, folks in the audience often go like, ugh, right? Or like, mm-mm. And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. It's really scary when we know the whole story. But if all we see is this object of a cup of coffee in the car with no other context, we're like, dude, I wish my car did that. Why are you upset? Right? And so something may be scary to the victim, but not to you as the responder. So you really want to ask them respectfully some follow-up questions. Questions like, what message did that send to you? What is the story behind that? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is a stalker saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. So the victim gets flowers, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so nice, because they don't know about that context. And so it's stalking that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes it a crime and or conduct violation, right? Because it's not typically a crime to send someone flowers. It typically is a crime to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do some digging and explain that because this is how stalkers get away with their behaviors. They engage in these things that on the surface, they say, oh, that's not scary. Flowers aren't threats. But yeah, not always. It all depends on the context. And of course, when we're thinking about context, we also want to think about the context of the adolescent's lived experience. Is someone with a lot more social power, for example, is stalking them? Um, as adults in the bigger world, we might say, well, they're all just students, who really cares? But within the context of a high school, someone with a lot more popularity, social power, clout, what have you, stalking, targeting someone with a lot less power, that context matters, right? In terms of why that behavior was so scary and the kind of influence that that offender might have. The reality is, if someone's afraid, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you at first, they probably know something you don't. So we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video and see how it plays out. All right, a very silly video, but we don't want to be that guy, right? There's no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. If a victim's afraid or in distress, even if you're not sure why, they probably know something you don't, right? Who here accurately assessed the risk? It was our victim. But is it fear? We can tell that lady's scared because she's jumping and screaming. But as you already know from your work with survivors, that's not always how they present. We know victims respond to trauma differently. Some might seem really sad or angry or really flat, no affect at all. And it's really a pretty vulnerable thing to say, I'm feeling scared, right? We're more likely to say, I'm annoyed, I'm bothered, this is weird, this is stupid. Um, and I'd say, not uniquely, but maybe especially for our young folks, it can be really embarrassing to say, I'm scared and I cannot handle something, right? Because most of our adolescents want to be adults and want to be seen as adults. And so they want to feel that they can handle it themselves, that they're not asking for grown-ups to step in, right? Because they're the grown-up, they can handle it. Um, and so there's also a lot of different language folks might use. Most people are not going to say, I'm experiencing stalking. They're going to say something like, my ex is being weird, my teammates being awkward, my dad's friends doing too much, this teacher's being really annoying. And it's up to us to be thinking, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? Um, there's a lot of minimization that happens, like y'all mentioned earlier. So because of repeated trauma as well. So if a student is followed every single day and you ask them, how much does that upset you? They might say, well, that's every day. What really bothers me is when they leave a note on my car because sometimes my mom sees that and that's really embarrassing. It doesn't mean the following every day was okay, right? It just means they've normalized it because of the repeated trauma. A helpful way to assess for fear when it's not being articulated is to ask victims what they've changed in their life as a result of the stalking behavior. Because I've had victims say, I'm not afraid of them. It's just annoying and stupid. It's whatever. But I changed my routes to and from school. I always walk with a friend now. I used to walk alone sometimes. I actually brought some pepper spray, like just in case they really surprise me. I changed all my passwords. Oh, and I just stopped using Snapchat because it wasn't worth it. They'd contact me on there all the time. Okay, so those aren't things you do when someone's kind of annoying you, right? That indicates a higher level of fear or distress. So ask about these accommodations. Have they changed account numbers and settings? They changed their password. They blocked the person on Snapchat. They stopped using TikTok. They turned their location off. If they spent money on devices or accommodations, so that could be things, or if they asked their parents to spend money on those things, right? Oh, I asked if we could get a Ring doorbell, whether they actually got one or not, right? Or I asked if we could leave town this one weekend. Increased security or privacy measures, those could be behavioral, like changing routes to and from class, walking with a friend, avoiding social events or avoiding extracurriculars because of that person, as well as privacy measures like I had this internship and I told them to take my photo off the website. And financial impacts. Um, I would add for our teams academic impacts as well, so that I couldn't go to class or I couldn't be in a group with project with that person. As well, I couldn't do go to the game anymore because they would just stand outside my car and I knew that I had to kind of go through them to get there. Um, and as well as employment consequences and any sort of tampering with accounts. And, our teens, certainly it's hard for anyone, including adults, to make these kinds of changes, right? It's not like adults can just get a new job or relocate. Like, that's not a huge deal. It absolutely is for a lot of our victims. And it's good to remember that our adolescents generally have even less control over their lives. They can't just leave. They can't go to another school without a lot of other kinds of intervention. And so, looking at these accommodations that might seem small, but might be big in the context of their life, right? If they've stopped using a social media app, if they've asked their parents to buy something different, if they used to love a speech and debate and now they quit the team, right? These things are significant in the context of their life. He said research on stalking is a limited and generally, and when it does happen, is often adult populations only, and there's a lot of that minimization. Folks often say, "Oh, it's young love; they're figuring it out," or they call it bullying, or occasionally harassment. Um, and there's that hesitation to admit being fearful, right? And so, kind of sharing what we do know about adolescent stalking with the caveat that research is limited and a lot more needs to be done. One place where it can get quite confusing is around this, is it stalking? So that's what stalking is. Um, but is it stalking? Is it bullying? Is it romantic pursuit? So if you look up bullying, which is often associated with this age group, right? It's unwanted aggressive behavior, involves a real or perceived power imbalance, behavior is repeated. And then cyberbullying is the same, but it includes some examples in the definition, like sharing information about somebody that's personal, private, or false, embarrassing or humiliating them, etc. And so if you look at these, it sounds quite a bit like stalking. Um, if you look at the examples from the stopbullying.gov website, they talk about socially that could include name calling, taunting, threatening, as well as sexual comments. It could be verbal, like spreading rumors, or physical, including physical violence. And so repeated aggressive power dynamic involves all these different kinds of behaviors that can be social, verbal, physical, or other. Um, that might be stalking, right? And so I think that different places have different policies on bullying, and but I encourage, and I don't have one clear answer here for, well, here's exactly when it crosses the line. um but I do think it's important to introduce the concept of stalking in our anti-bullying work and to be thinking about, okay, bullying's not always a crime, but stalking is. And when does it become actually potentially criminal? When is this person living in fear and this bullying is actually stalking behavior as well? Bullying and retaliation may be motivators for teen stalkers. And so, not all stalking is intimate partner. It could be those estranged friends, neighbors, classmates, rival team, right? Others, folks who they might encounter. And it can be challenging to differentiate between those. It can also be tough with romantic pursuit because developmentally appropriate pursuit behavior for adolescents looks different than developmentally appropriate pursuit behavior for adults. So, for example, if we see someone writing their crush's name 100 times in a notebook, if they're a teenager, that's okay. If they're an adult, we're like, what's going on, right? It is no longer developmentally appropriate. And if you think about how you acted pursuing or just liking, say, your first crush, or your teen, someone who you had a crush on as a teenager, I bet you, at least I feel like, oh, like, ooh, you were doing too much, girl, right? Like that's how I feel when I reflect back on that. But some of that's developmentally appropriate, right? We know we have strong feelings, we're learning boundaries, we are, often those feelings are very intense. And so those behaviors that might be a little more red flag as for an older adult might be developmentally appropriate for our teens. So how do we know where the line is? Well, again, there's no one moment where it then becomes stalking necessarily. It depends on your case, but typically our victims don't or our teens don't experience developmentally appropriate pursuit behavior as scary. They might say, "Oh, I don't like it," or even I don't like this person, right? Like I don't feel that way about them, but they're not necessarily scared. And so it's worth thinking about that. When does it become unreasonable behavior and when does it become criminal? And so some of these, again, behaviors are developmentally appropriate, but these are rarely experienced as threatening. So if they're writing notes and poems, if they're contacting them, if they're waiting, hoping to see them at the locker, and also, so that would be that intimate partner, Pete, or aspirational intimate partner. Could also be that idolizing celebrity figures, that's really normal at this age, right? So they might be sending fan mail, following them on socials, messaging them, have a big poster in the room, right? Like for me, it was Backstreet Boys. I had a big Kevin Richardson poster. I went to like all their concerts I could. And we know that that was appropriate because I was doing it. So obviously everything I do is fine. Um, but all of that, right? Displaying images, trying to learn everything about that person, that's generally appropriate unless it goes too far, right? Unless it becomes scary. or could be scary to that celebrity. Are they finding where they live and waiting outside? Are they expecting some kind of response and getting really angry when they don't get it, you know? And so, again, I wish I had a clear line for you of, well, here's when it becomes a problem. But again, I think we just need to think to ourselves, is this experienced as threatening? Is the target of this feeling scared? If they are, we need to honor that and recognize that this may be stalking behavior. And again, that bullying and romantic pursuit can become more stalking. And so here's a quick example of what sounds like a bullying stalking intersection, but they are charging it as stalking because of the severity and the duration of what's gone on here.
Good evening, I'm Ebony Coleman. We begin with a developing story out of Beaumont. Two Westbrook High School students are accused of stalking and harassing a fellow student for a year. 17-year-old Desani Matterson and Brooklyn Garrett are charged with stalking, a third-degree felony. According to court documents, the victim told police she faced near constant harassment at school, her job, and at home. Police say the victim changed her classes and her lunch schedule just to avoid them. Her mother even sent a cease and desist letter, but investigators say Matterson and Garrett ignored all of this. One of the incidents outlined in a probable cause affidavit says the girls skipped class to threaten her in the parking lot. They are also accused of coming to the victim's job and threatening to beat her up right there. According to court documents, the victim says she lives in a constant state of fear and has been suffering from panic attacks.
All right, so I think a strong example of that, something that folks might look at a glance and say, oh, bullying. But when you hear about the kind of changes that this victim has made, that she's gotten her mother involved, that she's changed her class schedule and, you know, gone through all this kind of work, when you hear that she's living in a constant state of fear, that she's having panic attacks, and that the offenders or suspects are showing up at multiple locations, that really sounds little bullying beyond, perhaps, into stalking.
Good evening.
So, stalking prevalence, stalking is a very prevalent victimization. In the United States, over 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. And unfortunately, this is often happening early. Over half of our victims are first stalked before age 25, and about a quarter of female victims and a fifth of male victims are stalked under 18. So in those child and or adolescent years, our young people are experiencing stalking behavior. And so we need to be addressing this and naming it early because unfortunately, it doesn't wait until our students get to college and or beyond. All kinds of people experience stalking. We know women and girls are more likely to be stalked, and the majority report the offender's male. That's regardless of the victim's sexual orientation. That's true overwhelmingly for our female victims. Over 80% of the time, their offender's male. It's also true about half the time for our male victims, about half the time their offender's male. So, what's going on there? Why are men stalking other men? Or if we're thinking of our adolescents, why are boys stalking other boys? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but some of it's that target dispersion. So you have an ex-boyfriend stalking an ex-girlfriend, she gets a new boyfriend. Okay, now he's stalking his ex and the new boyfriend as well. That's not all men stalking other men, but that is a big piece of it. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, you tend to see a lot of this, these kind of masked stranger, creeper in the alley sort of pictures, a lot of facelessness. To me, this very much applies anonymity. We don't know who this person is. Very similar to the images that might come up for the myth of the stranger rapist. And I'm sure it will not surprise you at all to know that this is not accurate. Usually, victims know stalkers, stalkers know victims. So I know you know that already. The reason I bring this up is because most people don't. When most people think about stalking, this is what they're thinking of. They're thinking about like a masked stranger, or they might be thinking about like a secret admirer, because we see that trope a lot in media, particularly media targeted towards teens. Or they might be thinking about an obsessed fan stalking a celebrity, because that's a lot of the stalking news that we see. And those folks tend to be more delusional and have significant mental health issues, right? So that person who thinks that Taylor Swift's talking to them through their lyrics or whatever. And so all those things can and do happen, but they're by far the minority of cases. So the challenge is you have victims saying things like, well, that's not a stalker. That's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, again, surprising no one here, that's a major category of stalking offender. Um, so over 40% of the time for our female victims, about a third of the time for our male victims, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. It's an extension of power and control from an intimate partner violence relationship. And I'll talk about that intersection in more depth in a few minutes. But that also means that's significant, right? 30, 40% intimate partner. That means 60 or 70% of the time, it's not intimate partner. It could be acquaintance, a stranger, though it's relatively rare, a brief encounter, like, excuse me, I met them at that party once, or I think they're kind of a friend of a friend. Like I recognize them, but I don't really know them. It could be a family member or a person of authority, a teacher, an academic advisor, a coach, a law enforcement officer, someone with some kind of power over the victim. This was a survey of adolescents asking who the stalker was. Here, the stranger numbers were negligible. And so we see the results are somewhat similar. Current or former intimate partner over 40% of the time. So that intimate partner violence relationship, about a quarter of the time, kind of like that brief encounter. I know them, um, but they're not really a friend or known person from school. They're not really a friend, and they could be from school or in similar proportions, not from school, right? Um, and over 10% of the time, a friend or a estranged friend. And so I encourage you when we're thinking about stalking, absolutely you want to recognize the intersection with teen dating violence and stalking. That's a big piece of this, right? 30, 40, or plus percent, absolutely, depending what numbers we're looking at. But that's not the whole story. And unfortunately, we have teachers stalking students, students stalking teachers, estranged friends stalking each other. We have a whole variety. And so it's important to think about, is your policy and is your education covering all those different kinds of relationships? And so we have a checklist of fun questions that you can be the most popular person at your next staff meeting. And think about, how are you identifying and serving all victims of stalking, intimate partner and not? Because again, if I'm being stalked by an estranged friend, I'm not going to Google dating violence help my area, right? And so thinking about things like, is the word stalking on your website? If your, counseling office has a brochure about, say, sexual violence, do they have one on stalking as well? Do you screen all your victims and survivors for stalking? Is stalking included in your awareness education? And so I won't say we make this easy to do because it's hard, it's work, right? But we make it as easy as possible in that if we're telling you at SPARC, hey, you should have a brochure, you can order it from our website. If we're saying you should screen for stalking, we have the questions. That being said, there's more to be done, so don't hesitate to reach out for what we're missing on better incorporating stalking into the work that you're already doing. And there are so many stalking behaviors. We certainly don't have time to go through them all. Um, but big picture, we want to recognize that our stalkers engage in this kind of crazy making tactic quite often. And so, for example, they might go to a victim's vehicle or home and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they've been there. Maybe they say, turn the TV on a channel they used to watch together. So the victim gets, let's say, home. They know that stalker's been there, but they're like, what am I going to do? Call the police and say someone turned the TV on? Like, I'm going to sound crazy. And so stalkers know that. That's why they do this behavior. In fact, nearly 1 in 5 victims report that exact thing. Stalker breaking into vehicle or residence and leaving some sign they've done so. So if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that's a red flag. This might be a stalking case. I'm not saying don't investigate it, but I'm saying let's investigate it. There are so many stalking tactics, and these categories overlap and intersect, but I think it's a helpful way to just expand our thinking on what stalking might look like. So I'm going to go through each category here and a few examples of each. Um, because when a lot of folks think stalking, they think surveillance. So you often get imagery of like binoculars or a camera. And surveillance is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing because anything scary, that's not the first thing that happened, could be a stalking case. Surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like in person or through technology. How is a stalker tracking, watching, monitoring, gathering information about that victim? And we want to recognize that many of our victims are experiencing stalking both in person and through technology. And so this was the Bureau of Justice Statistics study, and that we were able to separate out that 16 to 18 group here. Um, and so absolutely the technology is important to recognize and to know about, and we do training on the use of technology to stalk. We know our teens are digital natives who are using technology in different ways, and that can be quite powerful. Um, but also a quarter of our teens are only being stalked in person, not only to minimize it, but are singularly being stalked in person, and many are being stalked both in person and through technology. So when we think about surveillance in particular, absolutely we want to be thinking about putting a tracker on the vehicle, watching what they post on social media, demanding check-ins, demanding that they share location. But we also want to be thinking about those offline strategies, right? Just proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying asking third parties. So it could be asking mutual friends, hey, are they going to that party this weekend? Do you know if they got that internship in the city this summer, right? Um, or just driving by or walking by the house. And so all of these kind of surveillance tactics. Life invasion is that how are they showing up at the victim's life where the victim doesn't want them to be there? That could be unwanted contact. Most teens have phones with them most of the day or all day, right? And so it's across platforms, across applications. They're texting, they're calling, they're leaving voicemails, upvoting, downvoting, commenting, sit down to do their internship, job. And there's it's in their work email as well, just this constant trying to get to you. Could be showing up at school and other places, at work, um, at the person's home, at their friends' homes. And there's so much of that. Like, since when do you come to the speech and debate tournament? Since when do you come to the soccer game? Right? But they're just finding excuses to be there when the victim is there. Could also be that humiliation and harassing friends and family. And so many victims say, hey, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that they're calling my brother, my sister, my mom, my best friend, like it's really not okay. And this is common. This was a recent study about that cyberbullying. About 15% of teens experience someone other than a parent constantly asking where they are, what they are doing, or who they are with through technology. And so having someone who is demanding that constant check-in and that constant surveillance and that constant contact is often part of a teen stalking experience. Intimidation, explicitly or implicitly, how are they threatening that victim? That could be symbolic violence, like a threatening gesture or a crushed can, or read a case where a stalker kept breaking into the victim's home and slicing her underwear with a knife. Could also be those forced confrontations. They're standing in front of the of homeroom. I'd have to go through them to get there. I guess I'm not going to go to class today, right? Threats to harm oneself. That's really scary for our victims who usually have some kind of relationship with our offenders, or threats about harming others, family, friends, pets, etc. Um, One common threat that is made is that releasing intimate images, right? Also known as revenge porn. We don't like to call it that because it's not really about revenge. It's not really about porn. But we often see that non-consensual image distribution as part of a stalking case. Luckily, there are some great resources available. Take It Down in particular is for minors. Um, Exclusively. And so that's a good one to know. But there's also the image abuse helpline. But I encourage you to think about these cases. If our offender threatened to release the photo, and then bragged about it, I count three incidents, not just one, right? This might also be part of a stalking course of conduct. So again, zoom out. Is this part of a bigger piece here. Or interference through sabotage or attack. How are they actually harming this victim? What's changing in that victim's life? That could be financial and work, and I'd add academic or social sabotage. Um, Keeping them from leaving, so they can't get out of the house or out of the school or the classroom. Road rage, of course, a physical attack um, that harms the person, as well as property damage, right? Well, they slashed the tires on my mom's car and she drives me to school. So that interfered with my day. Or they got into all my accounts and changed the passwords. Now I can't log in and communicate with my friends. That interferes. So all these different kinds of interference. And so I bring this all up because, of course, we want to think about the variety of stalking behaviors, and also because if you typically ask victims, are you experiencing stalking? They're going to say, no, it's not stalking, calm down. But if you ask about these more specific behaviors, you're more likely to get more information. So asking about surveillance, have they been tracking, following, or monitoring you in any way? Have they invaded your life or privacy? And give some examples of what that might look like. Like, for example, do they text or contact you on a social media app a lot? Um, if they say yes to any of these, were you worried for the safety of yourself or others? Did you make life changes, right? Those accommodations I mentioned that we also saw in the video. Oh, I changed my class schedule. Um, and were you worried about financial, social, and I'd add academic impact, right? Um, and that helps to assess for that emotional distress piece. This is the short version of screening for stalking. There's also a longer version, though it only takes 10 or 15 minutes, called SHARP, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. We don't have time to go through it in detail today, but I just want to highlight that it creates this narrative report that's very concise, and it looks at 14 risk factors. You can use this with people of any age. You might just have to explain some terms and make sure you're, talking through this with a victim in a developmentally appropriate way. Um, but it's free. You can click on just testing it out, and it really helps to chunk out the information and tell the story of what's going on, as well as capture the big course of conduct and assess risk. And so I really highly recommend it. This says for law enforcement, but really for anyone. Here's also the big questions, as well as some examples, reminding folks, hey, this could happen in person, through technology, through a third party, etc., just to see if they disclose any of these behaviors when it's appropriate to ask them. Because again, most people have a sense of what stalking is. That's not accurate, and they may or may not say yes if just asked, are you being stalked? We have lots of resources on identifying stalking on our website as well, because we want to enhance the stalking response. We have to realize most victims don't enter the response. And even if they're trying to, they may not use the right terminology that triggers the response that they need. And so we want, as responders, need to be thinking, could this be fear? Could this be stalking? Many stalkers pursue their victim at least once a week. Many pursue daily. Most use more than one means of approach. And stalking can last a long time. The average duration of a stalking case is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. If you think about for our high schoolers, like in that short video, the stalking went on for over a year. That's a really long time for anyone, and especially someone under 18 years old, right? The kind of persistence that that takes. And so what this means is that when we're assessing risk and or safety planning, we're only capturing that moment in time. The case might look different next week, next month, next year. And so we need to be constantly assessing risk and updating our safety planning. Um, and look, a stalking case can be one afternoon to a whole lifetime. There's a big variety there, but we want to be thinking, what access or information does our stalker have about our victim? Um, because just because they haven't, say, shown up at the victim's home yet, doesn't mean they won't. So let's make sure there's a safe exit strategy and that parents are as involved as is appropriate. And maybe there's a camera so we can catch our offender if they do it, right? So thinking ahead as much as possible. So co-victimizations, like I said, not all adolescent stalking is related to teen dating violence, but a big piece of it is, right? Probably 30–40%, depending what study we're looking at. So I want to talk about that intersection here. So if we look at our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is you've seen before, I bring this up because often when folks talk about stalking and intimate partner violence, they often say something like, it was an abusive relationship and the victim left. And from the day that victim broke up with them, that abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, the abusive partner is contacting them constantly, showing up at school, showing up at their house, showing up at their friend's house, demanding check-ins, demanding that they know all their passwords, putting a tracker on the vehicle, threatening them, damaging their property, that's stalking. It's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse, and it's stalking. It's both. It can happen during and or after a relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well, but folks often don't call it stalking then. They call it emotional abuse, digital abuse. And it is those things, but it's also stalking. We want to know when stalking is happening at any point in a relationship, because we know that it often happens during as well. Nearly half of teens with dating experience reported that they experienced and or perpetrated stalking behaviors, and those are defined as spying on, following, damaging someone's property, going through online accounts. And so this is happening during and after the relationship. And we want to know when that's happening because, on average, our intimate partner stalkers tend to be the most dangerous. They tend to be the most threatening and violent. And so all stalkers can be dangerous, but generally, the closer someone is or was to a victim, the more dangerous they tend to be because they have that access and they have that information. They know their schedule, they know their friends, they know their passwords. And they know what will uniquely scare that person because they were once close to them, right? And that's what stalking is all about. And perhaps our teens sense this because in the survey, teen stalking victims were most afraid when the stalker was a former boyfriend or girlfriend. So, yes, absolutely, there are stalking relationships of all kinds. And our teens were most scared when it was that former intimate partner. And I think again, all stalkers can be dangerous, and that instinct is backed up by the research that those people tend to be the most threatening and violent. They're the most likely to use weapons, to reoffend. This was a study of adult women with protective orders. All were abused, all had protective orders. Some were abused and stalked. The ones abused and stalked had higher rates of all these harms across the board, everything from threats and physical violence to sexual violence, attack with a weapon, and injury. And that homicide connection I mentioned early on, a more recent study reinforcing this, stalking is a top risk factor for intimate partner homicide. It is a threefold increase in risk. And so we're going to watch a short video. And luckily, I'll tell you up front, this teen survives. But we can see that intimate partner, teen dating violence here, as well as that stalking intersection. I will say these clips are short because while the story I think is very powerful, the production of the clip I find pretty sensational. So apologies in advance for that. But it's great to learn more about this case and see this young woman speaking. So we're going to give this a quick watch.
And Sophia was keeping the terrible abuse a dark secret.
Did you tell your mom about this?
No.
Why not?
I was scared of what she would think. I didn't want to disappoint her. I was ashamed that I was letting someone treat me poorly.
Sophia was also afraid that telling her mother might make Adam even more dangerous.
She knew that if I knew what was really going on, I would have them break up. And she knew that that would send him off, that he would go into attack mode.
And that's just what Adam did when Sophia finally dumped him for cheating on her.
And how did he respond to that?
He would walk to my house, he'd cry, he'd wait outside for me, he'd watch everything I was doing. He'd stalked me.
I found that he was looking in the windows. I became very concerned.
He would sit outside my window and text me everything that I was doing.
Then a crazed Adam actually broke into the family's apartment through Sophia's bedroom window, brandishing a knife.
It's the middle of winter. I was literally in a t-shirt and underwear. I wasn't even wearing socks. And he was telling me to go outside with him. And I knew I couldn't do that. I knew that if I walked out with my knife-wielding ex in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, that I wouldn't come back.
He'd have killed you.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
How did you get him to leave?
After hours of just trying to tell him that everything was okay, that I promised I wouldn't call the cops, he left.
But Sophia's mom did call the cops, who arrested Adam on stalking and assault charges. A judge put him on 4 years probation and ordered him to stay away from Sophia.
Did you think you had solved the problem?
I did. Unfortunately, I didn't realize how sick he was.
All right, so what happens in this case is he relocates, he moves with his grandparents, they're 30 miles away. But a mutual friend is still reaching out to Sophia on Adam's behalf and saying, he's so hurt by what's happened. He's so sorry. He sets up a fake social media account and contacts Sophia. They resume dating and contact via that social media. Um, of course, he continues the abusive behavior. She breaks up with him again, and then she receives hundreds of text messages that are disturbing, right? Including threats of suicide, in particular, as well as threats to harm her and her family, right? I'll back up my car into the house and light the gas tank on fire. And so this really scary high stakes for Sophia in terms of him hurting himself, hurting others, and just this constant stalking behavior and constant information. Eventually, he waits for her in her home and attacks her again.
So you come into your room thinking nothing's wrong.
And now, fully recovered from the ghastly, life-threatening injuries she suffered, the brave teenager is reliving with me, only on Crime Watch Daily, what she thought would be her last night alive.
Did you think you would die?
Yes, 100%. It didn't even cross my mind that there was a possibility I would make it out.
So luckily, she does survive this attack. He's sentenced to 29 to 60 years in prison. And this article kind of haunts me, frankly, that they ask, do you think he'll come after you once he gets out? She said, 100% I think he will. Well, what can you do about it? Hide, change my name, move out of the state. I'm going to do that. I'm terrified. So a really, I think, strong reminder of the threats and how serious they are, what some of our teens are experiencing, that the abuse that happens during the relationship continues after, and that they're stalking during and after the relationship, that this is a persistent offender, and also the life of fear that this very brave teenager and survivor is experiencing, right? She's under 18 and she's saying when he's out in 60 years, I think he's going to come back, right? So that ongoing trauma, and that sense that I don't know when he'll be released and this could be bad again, and that it's never necessarily really over. And so I sometimes hear this called breakup violence. And I always think to myself, we're really talking about stalking, and we want to take that really seriously. Stalking can also intersect with sexual violence a few different ways. This is a survey of sexual assault survivors. They're older than adolescents. This is the youngest age group survey we have for this particular question, ages 18 to 24. And it simply asks them, have you been stalked as well? And nearly half are saying yes. And so we know these victimizations often go hand in hand. This can happen a few different ways. A stalker might be threatening to be sexually violent towards the victim, so that's the kind of threats and intimidation that they're using. They might try to get a third party to assault the victim. For example, they might impersonate the victim on a website, or post a fake ad pretending to be that victim, and then third parties respond. They might assault the victim at any point in the course of conduct, or sometimes there's sexual violence, and then after there's that contact, that becomes stalking, right? That you better not tell anyone. Or we had a case where a offender sexually assaulted the victim using an object, then kept mailing the victim that object, so that kind of continued intimidation after sexual violence. Sexual violence can also look like grooming, right? And so those offenders who are engaging in that repeat MO, those repeat rapists who are often targeting people who they see as vulnerable in some way. So that might be a child who seems neglected. Um, and using this kind of language like you seem really mature for your age, etc. um, and they're going to engage in this course of conduct that I encourage you to think about through the lens of stalking. They're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. You seem really mature for your age, let's hang out, build trust, meet in person, let's go to the basement and take some photos, coerce them into sexual violence, and often contact them after. And so when you think about this through the lens of stalking, it's a pattern of behavior. It's directed at a specific person, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And we know that these, again, victimizations often go hand in hand for undergraduate students. Um, 1 in 3 stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner, and more than 10% were physically assaulted. This is that same study of women with protective orders showing that it's not only an increase of sexual assault, penetrative rape itself, but other kinds of sexual violence as well. The victims abused and stalked at higher rates of verbal pressure, sexual degradation, and a variety of other sexual harms. And so, long story short, too late for you maybe, ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivor about intimate partner and sexual violence. But if you're working with a young person who's primarily coming in because of, say, um, teen dating violence, ask them about stalking behavior because we want to identify the full scope of harm and help them get the justice and safety that they need. This was a small but interesting study about teen stalkers, essentially showing that our teens who stalk are more likely to engage in a variety of types of violence. And so, what the survey did was it asked a bunch of questions. Have you ever done this, that, or the other? And those are all different stalking behaviors. And it split it up by boys and girls. And so, for girls who engaged in some stalking behaviors, they had higher rates of also engaging in these other behaviors, including teacher violence, assault, teen dating violence, and weapon use. So when girls were engaging in stalking behaviors, they're more likely to also engage in these other kinds of harm. Now, they identified some what they called comprehensive perpetrators. This was 6% of the students surveyed, and these were only boys. And these boys said they did every single stalking behavior that they asked about. So if you're not a numbers person, really you can just see that the numbers go up, and that's what matters, right? So for our boys who are not stalkers, they have that 0.01 for, say, threat and intimidation, and it goes up 7 times for if they are engaging in some stalking behaviors. And you see significant difference here, including physical violence, um, peer violence, teacher violence, etc. Now, what about our comprehensive perpetrators? They're engaging in all of those stalking behaviors. Wow, the numbers jump quite a bit again, right? So for some stalking behaviors, we're seeing higher rates of all these different kinds of violence. And for our comprehensive perpetrators that are doing a wide variety of stalking behaviors, higher rates significantly of all of these, including sexual assault, um, teen dating violence. I mean, it jumps so much, right? And so, all this to say that I'm not saying stalking causes these other harms, but stalking is an indicator that when we see a young person engaging in stalking behavior, particularly our comprehensive perpetrators, but also our some behaviors, folks, we need an intervention because this person stalking on its own is a criminal victimization that deserves our attention, and because they're more likely to be engaging in a variety of other kinds of violence, including physical violence, sexual violence, peer violence. So, all that to say, we want to call it stalking when we see it, so that we have the most options for accountability, so that we can safety plan appropriately and recognize the urgency here. Because so often there's a lack of urgency with our stalking cases. We want to be thinking, okay, stalking, I want to identify the full course of conduct. I'm going to think surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference. I want to think about what access to or information about our victim does our stalker have, and I want to recognize the higher likelihood of our victim to experience co-victimizations. If we just called it emotional abuse, harassment, digital abuse, we kind of miss that, right? We miss that higher threat sense of urgency and kind of activating those tools. And victim empowerment. Even if victims like, I don't want to do any of that. Like, I don't want to talk to the police or school security. I don't want to sit and make a safety plan. I don't want to go to counseling, right? Even just to be able to say, instead of my ex is doing too much, to be able to say, I'm being stalked. That's a real thing. I can Google it and information comes up. Of course, I hear the word stalking used all the time incorrectly, including, though not exclusively, in this age group, right? So you might have heard or said something like this, totally stalking you. Um, and I'm certainly not saying the casual use of the word stalking causes stalking. It doesn't, but I do think it dilutes the seriousness of the term because we're having people call it stalking when it's not, and we're not calling it stalking when it is. And we know most people, most victims tell friends or family first. So what does that peer or family member say? Do they say, wow, that sounds really scary. Let's get you some help? Or do they kind of say, like, is it stalking or is it stalking? Right? Because that can have a really chilling effect on if our victims continue to seek services or know where to go. And so I'm often asked for alternatives here, and so I have some for you. Um, it's people use the word stalking as shorthand for all sorts of things, I've realized. And so if it's I met someone interesting and now I'm Googling them, then it's I'm trying to find info on that person, or even I'm creeping on that person, right? Or overly contacting, I'm sorry, I'm nagging you, or cannot stop thinking about, I'm obsessed with this person, right? This language may not be perfect, but it's certainly better than using the word stalking, which is its own crime and victimization. And stalking is often standing in for these behaviors, many of which are pretty benign and not scary, right? If I post something on social media and my peer sees it, that's not really scary, right? What's scary is if they misuse that information to engage in a course of conduct that is causing fear. And so I think addressing that language and thinking through it is helpful. We also see stalking misrepresented in our media quite a bit. And of course, this is not unique to our young folks. We're all influenced by this. But we often see those stalking behaviors shown as romantic, where our usually male protagonist will stop at nothing to get the girl, and it's usually rewarded and it works. Or it's shown as funny, where it's a common trope in our sitcoms and cartoons that, like, ugh, there they are again, right? Like SpongeBob will not leave Squidward alone, right? That sense of they don't understand boundaries. Or it's shown as heroic, like Spider-Man's got to watch over, so if Mary Jane gets in trouble, he can swoop in and save her. Well, what do our stalkers say, especially intimate partner? They often say things like, I trust you, I don't trust the world around you, that's why I have to watch you to keep you safe. It fits right into the sense that surveillance is love, and that stalking is heroic. Or it's shown as edgy and sexy, right? Like, ooh, they went there, right? I'm like, no, who else is going there? 1 in 5 women and 1 in 10 men because they're victims of stalking. No, I like to see stalking in a horror movie. I'm like, that makes sense. It's scary. I think it's a lot more dangerous when we show it as romantic, funny, and heroic. And no one piece of media is the problem. It's fine to like what you like. The problem is there's a cumulative effect. And the cumulative effect is that it creates this fantasy of stalking. The fantasy is that the stalker is an attractive stranger or secret admirer who's desirable. They have good and pure intentions. At worst, it's like a SpongeBob situation where it's like, ugh, there they are again. They're so annoying. And at best, it's someone who really sees us, when it's chosen us, and we're supposed to feel really flattered. Um, and loved by this. And that's just not the reality of what stalking is, right? And so when I don't think there's any one reason for the minimization of stalking, but when I hear people say, like, oh, it's just a stalking case, I often kind of think to myself, oh, you're responding to the fantasy of stalking, not the reality of stalking. And at this point, there's very few sources of information about that reality. If you watch an episode of TV with sexual violence, usually something pops up at the end that says, hey, if you're experiencing this, call this number. We don't have that for stalking. And that's why it's on all of us to be that source of information. To not that we're dunking on any media that people can like what they like, but to recognize there is this cumulative effect that is miseducating folks. And to be that source of here's what this really looks like. And I think that media literacy is a great starting point for awareness programming around stalking. So a few minutes left here, and then I'll stick around for questions. Some very big picture tips on responding to victims. One, you've got to consider those mandatory reporting requirements, right? You cannot unring that bell. So make sure students know who is confidential, who is not, what processes might be put into place, which ones might be not, right? Because victims often feel that things are out of control, all these things are happening, and it's without their consent. And so to then replicate that in a adjudication process where they accidentally press the button and now all these things are unraveling can be really traumatic. And so make sure they know, who are those confidential versus mandatory reporters. Um, Again, zoom out. The victim tells you about an upsetting incident. Think, could this be, is this an isolated incident? Is it part of a stalking case? And have that lens on when you're hearing about bullying or harassment or teen dating violence. Can be thinking, okay, could this also be stalking? Recognize victims cope different ways. All of these are normal, healthy ways to cope with stalking, but some might be more helpful than others. One I want to address is this move away advice, and we often see this given to survivors, particularly they're not uniquely young people. And move away is anything that creates distance. And so they're often told, just especially with technology, just stop using it, right? So if you don't want people to share your photos, don't take any photos. If you don't want them contacting you on Snapchat, uninstall it, block them, change their phone number, delete your account, right? But let's play this out for a second. If I'm stalking you, and let's say I love to contact you on Snapchat, that's my favorite, right? And then eventually you're like, I am so over Dana stalking me. I'm going to uninstall this. Like, I'm out. I literally can't even use this app anymore. So eventually I go on there, I'm ready to stalk you, and I can't because it says this user is not found. Am I, the stalker, going to be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking and become a productive member of society today? No, I'm already stalking you. I know your email. I know your Instagram handle. I know where you live. I know your friends. I'm just going to find another way to you, and I might actually escalate my behavior and become less predictable because how dare you? That was my favorite way to stalk you, and you took it away from me. And so it's both. On one hand, you do want to recommend no contact with the stalker because stalkers see any response as reinforcement, right? And that may not be possible. And that might actually increase the risk to our victim. Now they're not going to get that message saying, I'm coming over, or see that that person's online or what have you. And so it's complicated. But that maintaining contact and or some kind of access might actually be a safety strategy that's messy, but it might be really helpful and be in the best interest of their safety. And so it's really about asking your victim, how do they think the stalker will react to them, blocking them, etc. You want to know that because it shows our resistance and persistence. It helps shows our offender's intent, right? You uninstalled Snapchat, Dana found you on Instagram. You blocked Dana, she started calling you. Okay, that shows my intent as an offender. That's good to know. But did that make you safer? Maybe, maybe not. I'd also add that all people, including teens, have some right to technology, right? That's how many of them connect. It can be a protective factor as well. And I often see a lot of victim blaming in this area, frankly, where there's this sense of like, well, if you didn't want them to know where you were, why'd you share your location, for example? At the risk of sounding overly twee, I feel like what did you share has become the new what did you wear? Where it's this, if you shared your location, of course they're going to come find you. No, the problem is not that someone shared their location. The problem is that a stalker saw that and felt entitled to approach that victim and misuse that information to cause harm. So just like with sexual assault, we can talk about risk reduction. We can talk about, hey, be in control of your settings and know who you're sharing with and who you aren't and all of that. But nothing our victim does or does not do in technology or otherwise is causing the stalking. The stalker is causing the stalking. So I think we need to rethink that framework as well and how we talk to young people about their digital privacy and security. I know I'm at time here. Of course, I understand if folks have to hop off right away. But just to wrap up with a few considerations and some resources, we're always looking at that balancing safety and freedom, right? many victims would be safer potentially if they stayed home and never met anyone or used the internet. But most of us don't want to live that way. And so it's always that balance and really being victim centered in what they are willing to compromise and what they aren't, right? What are you willing to do? What are you not willing to do? Incident log, really helpful, succinct. These are on our website. Date, time, what happened, where did it happen, if technology was used, what platform, because getting evidence from Apple is different than Google, is different than Meta. If there's any witnesses, if they've attached evidence, and if they made a report to anyone. A lot of victims don't really understand what um, stalking is, or I'm sorry, what jurisdiction is. So they might say, I told the police, and it's like, ooh, you told mall security, right? That could still be a good witness, though. And there's also jurisdictional issues. If they're going across county lines, they might call a different law enforcement officer or a different department. Even if they do call the same department every time, they might have a different responding officer. So when they get that call about the cup of coffee in the car, they might kind of roll their eyes. But to be able to say, hey, this is the latest in this course of conduct, and here's who else I've talked to, can go a long way. It's not fair to victims to do this. It's burdensome, it's time consuming, but it's helpful because these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math. And something like this can be very helpful. Of course, what we need most of all is that coordinated community response. What I see so often in these cases that go wrong, it really boils down to a lack of urgency and a lack of coordination. Different people know different pieces of information, no one's connecting the dots, and the stalking is not seen as urgent. It's not seen as something really serious like dating violence or sexual assault. Um, and so we need to change that narrative. And the reality is, after this 90 minutes, you now know more about stalking than most people in our field. That is the reality of the situation. And so our system's not set up for stalking cases, it's set up to be incident based. But as individuals in this field, you need to identify that stalking and really be that advocate for that victim, because if you aren't, likely no one will, and help walk them through this imperfect system. A couple of resources to help you do so. Victim Connect is the closest thing we have to a stalking hotline. So if you're ever sharing RAIN or DV hotline, this is a great one to share as well. They'll connect to local resources. Again, brochures, posters, handbooks, lots of information for free on our website. Awareness education, I think, is really critical here. And we have a lot of tools to start the conversation uh, on your campus, in your high school, in your healthy relationship program, whether it's a standalone program or incorporating it into existing. So definitely check those out. Here's my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for all of your good work. With thanks to interpreters and to everyone who stuck around. I know I'm a few minutes over. Look, I know it's easy for me to say, okay, think about this, use this tool, consider that, right? But you're the ones who are actually on the ground helping keep victims safe and hold offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done, and I totally understand and appreciate that. So truly thank you so much for the work that you do, and don't hesitate to contact us for further training, for resources, for anything that you might need. We do have an infographic and fact sheet on our website about adolescent stalking as well, so that can be a great thing to share. If you have time to do this quick evaluation, it's great to help us get that feedback. But yeah, thank you all so much. And with that, I'm going to check out the Q&A and see what's going on. But of course, if y'all have to go, I understand that. So thanks so much. One of the questions, okay, this is interesting. So they're saying, student has a friend who's had a crush on a guy for a long time. She's following him, saving pictures, following him on social media, saving pictures, going to games. It's probably developmentally appropriate. But now he's starting college. She's talking about finding where his dorm is, sending him love letters, maybe showing up to tell him how she feels. I have concerns, but is it stalking? If the person being stalked doesn't know about it, they don't have a chance to feel fear. Um, I mean, so I can't tell you based on this definitely is or definitely is not stalking. I think your concern is appropriate. As to this last piece, there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So if you're if this guy who currently doesn't know about this crush or what have you learns about it and then says, "Oh my God, she's been doing all that. That is terrifying." That could still be a stalking case, right? Because our later discoveries can change how we feel about earlier behaviors, right? Like if you got a box of chocolates today from Anonymous, you might be like, "Awesome." And if tomorrow you get a follow-up that's from your text from your creepy ex that says, "Hope you liked those. I found you again." Now we don't like it, right? So there's the behavior kind of starting clock doesn't have to be only after he's learned about the behavior, in other words. Um, that being said, this one I agree. I think it's stalking if it would make him scared. And it also, how is she going to handle if there is a rejection, what that looks like. So looking at someone on social media and trying to catch sight of them around school, that's probably not really scary. Continuing that even when they've created more distance and or ignoring boundaries, that's scary. And so I think it's about asking like, how do we think he'll feel? What kind of boundaries has he created? And then what happens if there is rejection? What's the plan there? Is it to say, "Oh, too bad," and move on with your life? Or is it to buckle down and engage in more like punitive or ongoing behaviors? Um, so yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but I think it's worth talking through with that student and seeing what their intentions are, especially their intentions if there is a rejection, and asking, why they're targeting this person. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful. Let's see, and then one more question here. Has there ever been a case where stalking was proved where a female student was stalking a male teacher? Any stats on that? No stats on that I'm aware of, but I'm sure yes. There's, again, unfortunately, stalking can and does go in all directions. Of course, we want to think about the power dynamic of those authority figures. We see a lot more cases of teachers stalking students, right? And adults stalking students and younger people. But yeah, we do sometimes see young people stalking older people, whether it's teachers, neighbors, friends of the family, etc. And so, yeah, I could see if I could find a case of that. I'm sure it exists, but it would definitely be the minority of cases. All right, well, thanks so much for sticking with me all. Appreciate you. And I hope to see you at another SPARC training soon. So keep in touch. Thanks, Emma, for sharing resources. Oh, and one person asked about human trafficking. Yeah, we do have a webinar on the intersection of stalking and human trafficking. So check that out. It's in the SPARC archives. All right. Thanks all.